The sun had begun its slow descent over the jagged horizon, painting the endless desert in hues of molten gold and crimson, as Eliza Whitmore fled the confines of a life that had always been too small for her spirit. Her skirts, once pristine and stiff from the carefully pressed fabric of a wedding gown, were now torn and soiled from her frantic ride along the dusty trail that wound through the canyons and mesas of the unforgiving frontier. She pressed her hat low over her brow, hiding the tears that had streaked her pale cheeks, and clenched the reins of her horse until her knuckles whitened. Every step of the animal kicked up clouds of dry dust that mingled with the sweat and dirt coating her arms, her neck, her trembling hands. Behind her lay the small town that had raised her, with its whitewashed houses and judgmental eyes, and behind that, a life she could no longer endure. A life that had promised marriage to a man whose warmth and kindness had never been extended to her, whose intentions were cold, calculated, and terrifying. The thought of that wedding night, of surrendering herself to a fate she had not chosen, made her stomach churn with fear and loathing. And she had ridden through the sun-baked plains like a woman possessed, with the wind ripping through her, hair in the horizon swallowing her in promise and peril alike. The wilderness around her was a strange comfort and a strange terror all at once. The cacti and sagebrush stretched toward the sky like silent sentinels, their shadows long and distorted in the late afternoon light, while distant mesas loomed like dark, jagged sentries against the glowing sky. Birds of prey circled high above, their cries slicing through the silence with a sharpness that matched the unease twisting in her chest. Every rustle in the dry brush, every snap of a twig under hoof, made her pulse leap, a reminder that here she was utterly alone, a fragile figure against the vast, indifferent expanse of the West. She was not used to this solitude. She had spent her life under the watchful eyes of her parents, neighbors, and the prying townsfolk. Yet, in the emptiness of the desert, she found a strange solace, the freedom to breathe, to think, to run, without the weight of expectation pressing down upon her shoulders. She exhaled slowly, letting the tension in her shoulders loosen slightly, though the ever-present fear of pursuit, of being found and dragged back to the life she had rejected, never fully left her. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time was a strange, fluid thing when one's heart was caught between terror and longing. She rode past a dry creek bed where tumbleweeds bounced like restless spirits, past a cliff's edge that dropped into shadowy canyons below, her horse moving tirelessly beneath her, as though it sensed the urgency of her flight. Her throat was dry, her legs ached from gripping the saddle, and yet she could not stop. She could not turn back. And then, as the sky deepened to shades of indigo and violet, a shadow emerged from the narrowing canyon ahead. At first it was indistinct, a blotch against the orange-red glow of the setting sun. But as she drew closer, her heart stopped in a way that made the air seem impossibly thick. A man stood at the trail, tall and broad-shouldered, his silhouette framed by the dying light. He did not raise a hand in greeting, nor did he call out. He simply stood, silent and still, a presence so commanding that the desert itself seemed to bow around him. His long, dark hair blew slightly in the wind, catching the last rays of sunlight, and the glint of something metallic at his hip suggested a readiness for danger. Eliza's horse instinctively slowed, snorting nervously, sensing the tension in the air. She too froze, unsure whether she had stumbled upon a savior or a threat. The man's eyes, dark and sharp as obsidian, met hers, and for a moment, time seemed suspended. He was Navajo, she realized instantly, though the recognition was more instinctual than learned. There was a calm, unshakable confidence in the way he held himself, a quiet power that made her heart race in ways it had never known. His gaze was intense, studying her as though he could see through every lie, every pretense, every desperate fear she had tried to bury beneath her haste and tears. Her lips parted slightly, a whisper escaping her in a voice she barely recognized as her own. "Please, I'm lost." The words were almost swallowed by the wind, but he heard them. He did not move closer immediately, did not speak, only regarded her with that unnerving, almost magnetic intensity, and then slowly, he allowed the faintest of smirks to cross his lips, one that was neither cruel nor mocking but suggestive of a confidence, a knowledge that unsettled and intrigued her in equal measure. "You still a virgin?" he asked softly, the words carrying a weight that made her pulse pound like a drum. The question was startling, intimate in a way that should have made her recoil, yet she felt a strange, inexplicable trust in him, as if the desert itself had conspired to bring them together in that precise moment. She blushed violently, her hands clutching the reins so tightly her fingers ached, unsure whether to speak, to flee, or to cry. But before she could respond, the warrior's smirk softened into something gentler, almost protective. "Not for long, darlin'," he said, and there was a warmth in his voice, a promise wrapped in a danger she had never known, but somehow instinctively believed. And just like that, in the fading light of the desert and the quiet hush of approaching night, the first thread of connection wove between them, fragile, electric, and irrevocable. The wind whispered through the canyons, carrying the scent of sage and dust, and she felt a shiver of something new and terrifying stirring within her. Hope. She had run from a life that demanded she surrender her body, her heart, her will. And yet, standing there before this man, tall, enigmatic, and exuding an untamed strength that both frightened and comforted her, she sensed that perhaps there was a different kind of surrender, one that could be gentle, passionate, and true. Her eyes met his again, searching for judgment, for ridicule, and found none. Only a raw, unspoken understanding that bridged the gap between two worlds, hers of confinement and expectation, his of freedom and the wild, untamed lands of the Navajo. And in that moment, as the first stars pricked the darkening sky, she realized that her flight had not only saved her from the life she despised, but had led her into the path of something far greater, far more profound, than she could have ever imagined, the stirrings of love in its most unexpected and exhilarating form. Eliza's heart hammered in her chest as she struggled to find her voice. The desert around them seemed impossibly vast, yet in that moment she felt as though it had contracted into a fragile bubble containing only the two of them. The warrior's presence was magnetic, an unspoken gravity that pulled at her very soul. She clutched the reins, her knuckles white, and forced herself to speak. I didn't mean to trouble you," she whispered, her voice quivering like the wings of a startled bird. The words were humble, tentative, the kind that carried the innocence of a woman who had been raised to defer, to obey, to fear the world outside her father's influence. He studied her quietly, tilting his head ever so slightly, as though weighing her honesty, her fear, her desperation. "You're not troubling me," he said finally, his voice a low rumble that seemed to harmonize with the rustling wind and the distant call of coyotes. "You're far from safe, I can see that, and yet you rode alone into my path. Lucky for you, or unlucky, depending on how you see it." His gaze was sharp, penetrating, yet not unkind. There was a sense that he could see into the very core of her being, glimpsing the pain and terror she had tried to hide behind her veil of composure. Eliza's lips trembled and she blinked rapidly as though to steady herself. I had no choice," she murmured. I couldn't marry him. I couldn't live that life." Her voice cracked and a tear slid down her cheek, catching the last light of the sun like a tiny fragment of fire. The warrior's smirk returned, softer this time, more like a shadow of a smile that promised understanding rather than mischief. "You ran from a cage," he said quietly. "I can see that. You're afraid but not broken. That's rare." He took a slow step closer, the sand crunching softly under his moccasins, yet he maintained a respectful distance. Eliza's breath hitched, a mix of fear and something far more complicated. Curiosity, fascination, an unspoken longing she had never allowed herself to feel. The desert, which had seemed threatening and empty, now felt alive with possibility. The silence between them was profound, stretching and bending in the heat-soaked air, carrying the weight of things unspoken and emotions too raw to articulate. For a long moment they simply regarded each other. The sun dipped lower, the sky bleeding into shades of violet and deep blue, and the first stars began to prickle the heavens like distant fires. Eliza's horse shifted nervously beneath her, sensing the tension and the unfamiliar energy that hummed like electricity between them. She reached absent-mindedly to brush her tangled hair from her face, her fingers trembling slightly as she tried to steady the storm of feelings rising within her. She was painfully aware of the difference between them, his confidence, his experience in the harsh land, his commanding presence won and her own fragility, the vulnerability of a young woman who had been sheltered and constrained for most of her life. And yet, there was something about him that made her feel safe. Paradoxically, even as her pulse raced and her thoughts swirled like a tumbleweed caught in a desert gale, the warrior spoke again, his voice calm but imbued with an intensity that made her shiver. "You've been running for a long time," he said. "The fear in your eyes, it isn't just for yourself. It's for the life you had no choice in. That's the thing about running. The past catches up even in the middle of the wilderness, but..." His gaze softened almost imperceptibly and a faint smile played at the corners of his lips. "There's courage in you. I can see it. And courage, that's worth more than the gold the world tries to sell." Eliza's heart ached at the words, so simple yet profound, as if he had reached inside her chest and understood every beat, every fear, every silent plea for freedom she had whispered in the dark while lying awake at night. She dared to look up fully at him, meeting his eyes without turning away, and felt an almost unbearable pull. I don't know if I can do this," she admitted, her voice breaking though she stood straighter as if drawing courage from some hidden well within herself. "I've never been alone like this. Not really." The warrior's expression softened further and he inclined his head toward her, the faintest flicker of amusement dancing in his eyes. "Alone is a dangerous word," he said, "but it can also be freedom. And freedom, little bird, is something you've earned tonight." His words, gentle and almost tender, wrapped around her like a warm cloak against the chill creeping in with the approaching night. He took another measured step closer, and Eliza felt the air between them thrum with possibility. It was not merely desire, though that prickled along her nerves. It was understanding, recognition, the acknowledgement of two souls colliding in the vast emptiness of the world, and perhaps finding in each other a sanctuary neither had known existed. She swallowed hard, the tension between fear and attraction coiling tight in her chest. He extended a hand, not in demand, not in assertion of dominance, but as an offer. She hesitated, trembling, her instincts screaming caution, yet something deep inside, a whisper of trust, compelled her to reach toward him. Their hands met, his grip firm yet gentle, and a shiver ran through her that had nothing to do with the chill of the desert night. "You'll have to trust me," he said softly, his gaze never leaving hers. "Not because you owe me anything, not because the world says you should, but because I can help you. I can keep you safe. And maybe," he added with a faint smirk that made her cheeks flush, "we can teach each other something about living, about being free, about feeling." Eliza's breath caught, a combination of relief and fear and something far more intoxicating swirling together in her chest. She nodded slowly, barely daring to speak, the words stuck in her throat. Yet her eyes said it all, a tentative willingness to allow herself to lean on him, to see in him not just a stranger but perhaps a protector, a friend, something more. As the stars multiplied in the indigo sky, the first traces of night enveloped the desert, and the wind whispered secrets through the canyons and mesas. They stood together, two figures cast against the vast wild land, connected by something unspoken yet undeniable. And in that suspended moment the runaway bride realized something that made her heart both soar and tremble. Her flight had not led her into emptiness, into danger alone. It had led her to him, the man who was part mystery, part strength, part warmth. And the first spark of something extraordinary, something forbidden and exhilarating, flickered to life between them. Night fully descended upon the desert, wrapping the mesas and canyons in a cloak of deep indigo and scattered starlight, while the wind whispered softly through the sagebrush and jagged rocks. Eliza Whitmore's breath came in shallow, uneven bursts as she tried to calm the storm of emotions raging inside her. She had never been alone like this, never felt the freedom and terror of the open land pressing against her in equal measure. The Navajo warrior, whose name she still did not know, remained a constant presence at her side, the faint glow of his silhouette blending with the silvered desert shadows. He did not crowd her. He did not demand her trust. Instead, he moved with the grace of someone who had learned to live with the land, with the wind, with the danger that lurked in every shadow, and somehow, his mere presence made her feel less fragile, less like the frightened girl who had fled from the rigid walls of a home she could no longer call hers. The warrior finally broke the silence, his voice low and steady, carrying the warmth of reassurance. "There's water not far ahead," he said, gesturing toward the faint glimmer of moonlight reflecting off what she assumed was a creek or small spring hidden among the rocks. We should rest there for the night. Your horse is exhausted and you need more than rest, I think. Eliza's throat tightened at the thought of being so vulnerable, so dependent on a man she had only just met. Yet there was no malice in his gaze, no hidden motives, only an unspoken promise of protection. She nodded, unable to speak, and allowed him to lead the way. Her horse, sensing the subtle authority and calm of the warrior, moved obediently beside them, the sounds of hooves crunching against the dry, gravelly soil echoing softly in the canyon. As they reached the small spring, the soft burbling of water over smooth stones was a balm to her frayed nerves. Eliza dismounted with trembling legs, the effort leaving her knees weak and her heart thudding in her chest. She knelt by the edge of the water, cupping her hands to drink, the liquid cool and sweet against her parched lips. The warrior watched silently, leaning against a nearby boulder, the firelight from a small lantern he had lit casting flickering shadows across his strong, angular features. There was a stillness to him, a quiet patience that both unnerved and comforted her. She dared to look at him directly, her blue eyes reflecting the shimmering light, and felt her heart ache with an intensity she did not yet understand. "Thank you," she whispered, the words fragile, almost lost in the night air. I don't even know your name." He inclined his head slightly, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Names are for people who have time to care about them," he replied, though the warmth in his tone betrayed his teasing intent. "But since you seem to be sticking around, you can call me Kale. Kale Yazzie." The name rolled off his tongue like a melody, each syllable carrying weight, history, and the echo of a culture that was as old and enduring as the land around them. Eliza repeated it softly, savoring the sound, feeling somehow more anchored simply by knowing how to address him. "Eliza," she said, almost shyly, as if the world itself might judge her for speaking it aloud. Kale nodded, his expression softening, and for the first time, she allowed herself to notice the way the lamplight glinted off his dark hair, the strength of his shoulders beneath his worn leather vest, the calm, steady gaze that seemed capable of seeing into the very marrow of her soul. Night stretched on, and Kale guided her to a small alcove beneath a rocky overhang where they could rest safely. He laid out a rough blanket for her and encouraged her to let her horse graze nearby under his watchful eye. The desert, which had seemed so hostile only hours ago, now felt protective, a sanctuary shaped by the presence of the warrior who had appeared as though conjured by fate itself. As she settled onto the blanket, Eliza's thoughts swirled, terror, awe, attraction, gratitude, all entwined like vines, difficult to separate, impossible to ignore. Kale crouched beside her, not pressing too close, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, the subtle strength that suggested a lifetime of surviving the harsh world they now inhabited together. "You shouldn't have come out here alone," Kyle said softly, his voice cutting through the quiet like a gentle knife. "The world isn't kind to girls who run from what's expected of them. But I can see. You couldn't stay. You had to choose freedom, even if it terrified you." Eliza looked down, ashamed for a moment that her fear had driven her into such vulnerability, yet Kyle's gaze held none of judgment, only understanding. I didn't know what else to do," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't marry him. I couldn't give myself to someone I didn't love. I couldn't be trapped." Kale's hand moved slightly, hovering near hers, not touching yet, and she felt an almost electric shiver run through her body. "There's more courage in fleeing than most people understand," Kale said, his voice low, almost reverent. "It's easy to obey, to bend, to let the world dictate your life. But it takes a rare kind of bravery to say no, to walk into the unknown, and to hope." His eyes softened, locking onto hers, and she felt her pulse race uncontrollably. "To hope that someone somewhere will see you for who you are, and not just for what the world expects of you." Eliza's lips trembled, and she pressed them together to keep from crying again. No one had ever said such things to her. No one had ever spoken with such sincerity, such insight into the fear and longing that had haunted her for months, for years. And yet here he was, a man she had only just met, and already she felt her soul opening, like a fragile flower stretching toward the sun after a long, harsh winter. Kyle finally lowered himself to sit beside her, careful not to crowd her, careful not to overwhelm her fragile courage. "Rest now," he said gently, The night is long, but you'll be safe here. And when you wake, we'll ride together. I'll make sure the trail is clear and that your flight doesn't end in danger." His voice was calm, commanding, and yet tender, like a lullaby sung in the key of trust. Eliza nodded, exhausted from the long ride, from the emotional strain, from the sheer weight of having dared to defy a world that sought to control her. She curled herself into the blanket, the night air cooling her flushed skin, and felt the faintest brush of reassurance from Kyle's presence nearby. Sleep threatened to claim her, and for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to hope, allowed herself to believe that perhaps the world held more than confinement, fear and despair, that perhaps it held something like this: safety, understanding, and the tender stirrings of a love she had never imagined she could feel. As she drifted into an uneasy, yet peaceful slumber, Cale remained vigilant, his eyes scanning the desert shadows, his senses alert for any sign of danger. But even as he watched, his mind lingered on her. The softness in her voice, the fragility wrapped in quiet strength, the innocence that had survived despite the cruelty of the life she had escaped. And beneath that protective vigilance, an undeniable thought took root, one he had not expected, a desire not just to shield her from the world, but to know her, to touch her, to become the one constant in the vast, unforgiving expanse that had shaped both of them. The night deepened. Stars glimmered like scattered diamonds over the mesas, and the desert held its breath around them, bearing witness to the beginning of a bond that promised to defy the harshness of the Wild West and the expectations of a society that would never understand their love. The first rays of dawn stretched across the horizon like pale fingers brushing the jagged desert cliffs, and Eliza stirred beneath the thin blanket Kyle had provided. The night had been a restless one, her dreams a tangle of fear, longing, and fragments of the life she had left behind. She awoke to the soft light of morning spilling over the rocks, bathing the canyon in a muted gold that made the world seem fragile, delicate, and filled with possibility. Her heart still pounded from the events of the previous day, from the ride, from the encounter, from the strange, intoxicating presence of the man who had appeared almost like a vision from some otherworldly place. She pressed her hands to her chest, trying to slow her heartbeat, trying to ground herself in the reality that Cale was not a dream, that the warmth she felt near her was real, solid, and undeniably human. Cale was already awake, sitting a short distance away, tending to the small fire he had built to cook a modest breakfast. The flames flickered in the morning light, casting shadows that danced across his angular features, and Eliza found herself staring, captivated by the quiet strength and effortless grace that seemed to define him. He noticed her gaze and tilted his head, the faintest smirk playing across his lips, though his eyes held a softness reserved only for her. "Morning," he said, his voice gentle yet resonant, a sound that seemed to blend seamlessly with the wind and the rustle of the desert brush. "Sleep well?" Eliza nodded, her throat tight, words caught somewhere between shyness and the whirlwind of emotion that still consumed her. As Cale prepared a small meal of roasted coffee beans and dried meat, Eliza found herself inching closer, her bare feet brushing the rough stones of the canyon floor, careful not to disturb him but desperate to feel connected in some small way. The desert around them seemed to hold its breath, the stillness a protective cocoon around the pair. She finally spoke, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. I never thought I'd find someone like you, out here," she confessed, the words trembling as they left her lips. Cale's eyes softened, the intensity replaced by something warmer, more intimate. He reached out, just enough to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear, and the contact sent a shiver down her spine. "Someone like me?" he asked, the hint of amusement mingling with earnestness in his tone. "I've seen the land, the wind, the storms. I've fought, survived, and walked paths you cannot imagine. But if by someone like me you mean someone willing to stand by you, then yes, perhaps I am." Eliza swallowed hard, the lump in her throat growing, her innocence and longing tangling with a desire she did not yet fully understand. She had never been looked at like this, never been seen, truly seen for more than her beauty or the obligations her family expected her to fulfill. And yet here in the silent vastness of the West, with Cale's dark eyes fixed on her, she felt both protected and exposed, vulnerable and exhilarated all at once. She dared to speak again, her voice firmer this time, though still trembling. I've been so afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of what I'd have to give, of losing myself. of being forced to live a life I didn't choose. Kyle reached for her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers, his grip firm, grounding, reassuring. "Fear is natural," he said softly, "but you're not alone anymore. Not while I'm here." For the first time, Eliza allowed herself to truly lean into him, resting her head lightly against his shoulder. She felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her ear, the warmth of his body a stark contrast to the chill morning air. The desert around them seemed to hum with life, the wind whispering through the canyons as though echoing the emotions vibrating between them. Cale's hand moved gently to her cheek, his thumb brushing away the remnants of sleep and dust, and Eliza closed her eyes, savoring the tenderness in a world that had often been harsh and unyielding. "I've never," she began, but the words faltered, the raw vulnerability too much to articulate. Cale's lips found her forehead in a light, protective kiss, a silent promise that she was safe, that she was cherished, that she was free. The intimacy of the moment, the sheer vulnerability stirred something deep within Eliza, a feeling she had never dared to acknowledge before. She looked up at him, her wide eyes shimmering with a mixture of trust, wonder, and the beginnings of love. "Kyle," she whispered, barely more than breath, "I don't know what will happen. I don't know if I can ever truly be safe. Or happy." His fingers caressed her jawline as he lowered his face closer, the air between them charged with anticipation yet tender restraint. "Happiness is something you earn," he murmured, his voice a blend of desire and devotion. "And I intend to help you find it. Not by forcing it, not by demanding it, but by standing beside you, by letting you discover it in your own time." They remained like that for what felt like hours, two souls suspended in the desert dawn, the world around them fading until only the quiet intimacy of their shared presence existed. Eliza's shyness met Cale's protective strength, creating a balance that neither had known they needed. He was gentle yet commanding, patient yet magnetic, and she found herself slowly surrendering to the comfort and thrill of being seen, of being desired not merely for her beauty, but for the fragile, courageous spirit she carried inside her. The air seemed to hum with possibility, the wind carrying the scent of sage and dust, the distant call of birds marking the slow march of the day, and in that fragile, breathtaking morning, under the endless sky of the Wild West, the first real spark of love ignited between them, tentative, electric, and undeniable. Eliza rested her head against Cale's chest a little longer, feeling the strength in his heartbeat synchronize with her own. The fear that had dominated her life, the terror of losing herself to a fate she had never chosen, began to ebb just slightly, replaced by the first glimmer of hope, of trust, of something more profound than mere survival. Cale whispered her name softly, a reverent sound that made her shiver, and she realized that for the first time in her life, she was not alone. The desert, once a harsh, indifferent expanse, now seemed like a world brimming with possibility, guided by the presence of the man who had entered her life so abruptly yet irrevocably. And as the sun climbed higher, casting a golden sheen over the jagged cliffs and mesas, Eliza allowed herself to believe, if only for a moment, that perhaps love could exist even in the most unforgiving corners of the world, and that she might just have found it in Cale, the Navajo warrior who had claimed her trust without force and her heart without question. The sun had risen fully now, casting the desert in a brilliant light that seemed to wash over the world with warmth and promise. Eliza Whitmore stood beside Cale Yazzie, her fingers intertwined with his, their shadows stretching long across the rocky terrain as though the land itself acknowledged the union forming between them. The flight that had brought her here, the fear and desperation that had driven her across miles of untamed frontier, felt distant now, like a dream she had finally awakened from. She looked at Kyle, at the man who had appeared almost like a guardian spirit in the night, and felt the surge of a love so deep and encompassing that it left her breathless. The desert wind tousled her hair, and for the first time in months, perhaps her entire life, she felt the weight of fear lift from her shoulders. She was free, truly free, not only from the constraints of her past but from the uncertainty that had plagued her heart. Kyle, sensing the quiet shift in her spirit, brought her closer, his arms steady and warm around her trembling frame. "You've come so far," he murmured, his lips brushing the top of her head, his breath carrying the faint scent of the desert and the strength of the land. "And yet, you still shine, Eliza, braver than anyone I've ever known." Her eyes glistened with tears, Not of sorrow this time, but of relief, gratitude, and the overwhelming joy of finding someone who saw her, truly saw her, and accepted all that she was. "Cale," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. I never thought I'd feel safe again. I never thought I'd feel this." Her words were lost in the wind, but he understood. He had seen the fear, the fragility, the courage that had driven her to run. And now he saw the blossoming of something far more profound. Love, unguarded and mutual, blossoming like a rare flower in the harshest soil. The two of them spent the morning preparing a modest camp, Cale teaching her small ways of surviving in the desert, guiding her hands as she learned to start a fire with flint, to recognize the tracks of animals in the sand, and to listen to the subtle language of the wind. Each lesson was gentle, patient, and infused with a kind of quiet intimacy that made her heart ache with affection and desire. For her part, Eliza offered what little she could in return, sharing stories of her past, her dreams, and her fears. The barriers that had once seemed insurmountable, her timidity, his stoic nature, the world's judgment, began to crumble under the warmth of their growing bond. Every glance, every touch, every shared smile wove a tapestry of connection that neither the cruelty of her past nor the harshness of the land could sever. By midday, they rode together along the winding canyon paths, their horses moving in rhythm, as if guided by the invisible thread that now linked their hearts. The desert seemed alive around them, the mesas glowing like molten gold under the sun, the wind carrying whispers of freedom and renewal. Cale's hand brushed hers occasionally, light, tentative, each touch sending a thrill through her that was equal parts innocence and awakening desire. Eliza leaned slightly into him, her trust growing with each mile, and he matched her steps with careful attention, protective yet gentle, a partner in every sense of the word. In the silence between them, the world seemed to contract until only their shared presence remained, a quiet affirmation that they had both found in each other what the world had denied them, a home for their hearts. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon once more, painting the sky in shades of rose and amber, Cale stopped beside a small, secluded mesa that overlooked the vast expanse of the desert. The beauty of the scene took Eliza's breath away, but it was Cale's gaze, steady and unflinching, that made her heart flutter with a depth of emotion she had never known. "Eliza," he said softly, kneeling on one knee, his hands holding hers firmly yet reverently. "I cannot promise the world will be easy. The West is harsh and life is never simple. But I can promise you this, that I will stand by you, protect you, and love you as fiercely as the land loves the sun and the wind. Will you stay with me? Will you share this life, this freedom, this love?" Her tears spilled freely now, warm and shining in the dying light, and she nodded, her voice choked with joy. "Yes, Cale. Yes, I will." The world seemed to exhale in response, the wind swirling gently around them, the stars beginning to prick the sky above even as the last rays of sunlight clung to the cliffs. Cale drew her close, their foreheads touching, breaths mingling, hearts beating in a shared rhythm that neither time nor hardship could break. For the first time, Eliza allowed herself to feel fully, to embrace the depth of her love and trust, to surrender not in fear but in mutual devotion. The Navajo warrior, fierce and untamed, tender and protective, held her as though she were the most precious thing in the world. And in that embrace, the scars of her past, the terror, the forced obligations, the heartbreak, melted into insignificance. Together they stood as one against the endless desert, two souls intertwined, unafraid and irrevocably bound by love. As twilight deepened into night, Cale led her to a small alcove beneath the mesa where a gentle fire awaited, its glow reflecting in their eyes. They shared a quiet meal, laughter spilling easily between them, the weight of fear and uncertainty replaced with the buoyant lightness of love realized. And when the desert finally fell silent, save for the distant call of coyotes and the whisper of wind through the rocks, they lay beneath the vast star-studded sky, hands entwined, hearts aligned, and souls finally at peace. For Eliza Whitmore, the runaway bride who had once feared the very life she now embraced, and for Cale Yazzie, the warrior who had found not just a companion but a heart worthy of his own. The Wild West had become a place not of fear and isolation but of freedom, love, and an enduring promise that they would face the world together, forever.